I was basically kidnapped by the Alberta government today. They took away my cell phone, my watch, and every single internet-enabled device that I have and held me in a room of mostly mainstream media enemies and frenemies, but it was for a good reason. Today is budget day, and I was embargoed in the building behind me since 7:30 this morning so that I could bring you all the analysis. Sheila Gunn Reid at the Edmonton Legislature grounds for Rebel News. Now, I spent all day in a room full of media, guarded by sheriffs, reading 232 pages of financial information. And here are my takeaways for this second budget in Alberta in just 4 months. Albertans are $85.9 billion in total outstanding debt. Albertans will pay over $2 billion in debt servicing costs this year alone, 3% of total revenue, higher than the budgets of all government departments except for the 4 ministries of health, education, advanced education, and social services, which is a testament to just how much money we're wasting on banksters by not getting our fiscal house in order, but also just how enormous those 4 ministries are in relation to the whole of government. Jason Kenney's latest deficit is actually $100 million higher than Notley's last budget in 2018 at $6.8 billion. However, the deficit is $1.2 billion lower than first predicted in last year's budget. So that's good, not great. So to be clear, Jason Kenney is spending less than the UCP first estimated and spending about $59 million less than Notley when we look at just expenses. But Kenney still has a slightly higher deficit than Notley did in her last year on the job. So that's the bad news. Here is some good news for business owners. We're seeing a return or an attempt to return to the Alberta Advantage through business tax competitiveness with a combined corporate tax rate that's now 4 points lower than the rest of the West. With the continuation of the job creation tax cut, the Alberta corporate tax rate that has already fallen from 12% down to 10% will continue to fall to 9% next year and then 8% the year after. And despite the NDP's constant complaining about these tax cuts being a multi-billion-dollar giveaway to corporations, corporate tax revenue is expected to grow by $294 million to $4.5 billion during the next fiscal period. And the public sector layoffs everybody predicted, well, last year, 210,000 people worked for the provincial government, and this year, 208,000 and change still work for the government. Just 1,400 public sector jobs have been cut, mostly at agriculture and forestry and advanced education, and mostly through attrition. The government is aiming for a reduction in public sector jobs of 7.7% over 4 years. I think it needs to be closer to 25%, especially after Notley went on that 50,000 person public sector hiring spree back in 2015. Also, disappointingly, we aren't seeing the sorts of spending cuts in the larger ministries fiscal conservatives who make up so much of Jason Kenney's base would have hoped to have seen in this budget. These are spending cuts the left thinks are absolutely imminent. For example, education spending will increase by $100 million to $8.3 billion. Healthcare spending is up too, from Notley's $21.9 billion to $22.2 billion this year. Operational spending is only being cut by 3%. So it would seem that instead of truly making the hard decisions Jason Kenney promised he'd make to get spending back under control after a decade of unrestrained government growth, Kenney is instead choosing to hope his tax cuts spur economic growth and convince investors to overlook Trudeau's failures and all-out attacks on the oil and gas front and suddenly decide to invest again in Alberta. Now, I was able to get a couple of questions into Finance Minister Taves at the afternoon press conference. I wanted to see how he thought he stacked up against the spending of former NDP Finance Minister Joe Ceci. Just watch. Your government's deficit is $100 million more than the last NDP budget, and spending is only being rolled back at 3%. How does this all square with the criticism leveled at that last NDP government by Conservatives, specifically when they're campaigning? If we look outside of the tax cuts and a few allocated line items, revenue and expenses look a lot like that 2018 NDP budget.
Well, it's interesting. We would suggest, in fact, I think you would find it clear if you spend time in this budget that our fiscal plan is very different than the previous government fiscal plan. Firstly, in the year that we're in, we offloaded the crude by rail liabilities, quite frankly, that we inherited from the previous government. We put a provision in Budget 2019 of $1.5 billion. We've actually offloaded those contracts for something just less than $1.3 billion. And so that's a fiscal reality that Albertans had to deal with in the current year, and that's had a big impact in our results. We do have a schedule in our fiscal plan which basically shows the trajectory of both the previous government's fiscal plan and our fiscal plan based on our current revenue predictions. We end up with an accumulated debt differential of $16.2 billion at the end of the fiscal period. That's very significant. For every $1 billion of debt, Albertans pay approximately $30 million in debt service costs. So we do end up at a very different place.
I want to follow up to a question that was asked previously about your demand for the $2.4 billion retroactive fiscal stabilization payment from the feds. I appreciate the strong language demanding, but what is the or else? What happens if the feds say no?
Well, I mean, quite frankly, we have a fair deal panel that is taking a look at a number of initiatives that may be in the best interest of the province to implement. And we'll be evaluating our response on all of those fair deal panel items. We've also, and the Premier's been clear about this, if we do not see Alberta's interests considered going forward, we will have a referendum on equalization in October of 2021. Those are things that we will tangibly do to look after the best interests of Albertans. Now, with respect to the fiscal stabilization ask, we're making a very credible, defensible ask here, and that ask has been supported by all 10 provinces. Saskatchewan has a vested interest. Newfoundland have a vested interest in this cap lift as well. And so, again, we're looking forward to a response from the federal government.
Thanks. Okay, so those are the nuts and bolts and the numbers of the budget. Now for the inside story from inside the budget lockup. Global, CTV, CBC, Chorus, and Postmedia, they sent entire tables of people to read the documents and do stories. I had a couple of friends, a bunch of frenemies, and a lot of people who didn't like me locked in a room with me. It was like a big old-fashioned get-together up there in the federal building. Breakfast and lunch were catered and brought in for the journalists about to write some hit pieces. In fact, the journalists were visiting at their tables so loudly, at one point, government staffers had to come in and tell them to keep it down so that the rest of us trying to work could hear the question and answer portion of the technical briefing. But let me tell you about something else that you may not know about. Rebel News helped one of our competitors, actually they're not really competitors, they're more like our haters. They're people who actively tried to get us banned and deplatformed and censored, and we helped them get into the budget lockup last minute. When the rabid lefties over at Progress Alberta were blocked from the budget lockup by the Alberta government, one of their reporters had to go to court to get an injunction to be allowed in. That man's name is Duncan Kinney. Progress Alberta hired the very same Edmonton law firm that we use, and it worked for them. But there's a catch. We had to let our lawyers help a media operation because that media operation employs someone we're suing as part of our deplatforming.com campaign to end the lefty bully mob chasing Conservatives out of the public square. You see, we could have stopped our lawyers from helping them because of the obvious conflict of working for both of us. But we didn't, because we know that law firm is one of the best in the business, and we fight for freedom over here. Everybody's freedom. In fact, we even let our Toronto lawyers divulge materials that would help Progress Alberta. Not only would Progress Alberta never help us, they've actively deplatformed us at the Princess Theatre when we tried to hold a book signing there. But we helped them. We helped to strengthen the laws about media access. When we at Rebel News say we care about free speech and the free press for everybody, even for people who want our company dead, We absolutely mean it. We'll even release our lawyers to help. And while I'm sure going forward you might hear how mean old Jason Kenney tried to keep a media outlet out of his budget day, you won't hear about the role we played in standing up for the free press for everyone. For Rebel News at the Edmonton Legislature, I'm Sheila Gunn-Reid. Make sure you're subscribed to our channel, that you've liked this video, but also make sure that you turn on the notifications. Just ring the bell so that you never miss a story from Rebel News.